All right, so today we have a guest speaker who has been involved in entrepreneurship at CMU for a while, graduated last year, 2020. Um, so not too sure what he's been working on now, but I'm sure it's been a great few months out of CMU. So today is going to be talking a bit about, I guess, the entrepreneurship process. I guess I should also mention that he was one of the original founders of the Idea to Startup cohort, which is basically the Stuco a few years ago. So you can thank him for being here today. So uh, it's all up to you now. Floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Vivek. Me and Vivek worked on previous iterations of this, so this is super casual. You know, you don't have like a super formal guest speaker or anything. So let me just kind of wait. Can you give me screen sharing access?
Yeah, check now.
Cool. All right, let me present this. So yeah, I was working on these right until the dot. But cool. So like Vivek said, I kind of have a lot of awesome stuff I want to talk about, things I'm super excited about. First, I want to talk a lot about myself because I like talking about myself. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory of entrepreneurship. It's something that I always thought was wishy-washy when I was going through a lot of accelerators, but I think as time has moved on, I've begun to appreciate a lot more, but I'll try to make it as concrete as possible. It's like super high level. And then this is kind of a stretch goal if we have time, but there's this new codeless programming thing that I learned about just this weekend. So I started playing around with it a little, and I thought it would be something cool to share because I know it would have helped me a lot when I was kind of starting a company at CMU. So cool. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, my kind of where I draw my experience from. First, entrepreneurship experience is from being a founder. So I founded my own basically social network when I was at Carnegie Mellon called NetScale, which scaled to a few hundred users, was revenue generating, like, early talks with VCs and stuff. But I also have worked a lot in accelerators. So like Vivek said, we actually did a few iterations of the Idea to Startup cohort. And so we have a lot of direct experience directly helping CMU students start companies at CMU. But even outside of that, I've worked at more professional accelerators like Mass Challenge, which is a big accelerator on the East Coast. And when I was in high school, I went through MIT Launch and kind of was a mentor for that, which is like a high school accelerator program. So I think it's really my experience in accelerators that has helped me kind of refine the entrepreneurial theory aspect of it, which is just how do you kind of get a cohort to build a successful company. And that's why I'm really excited about it. And as to what I've been doing the last few months, I'm actually a product manager at a company called Roblox. So I kind of have been helping them build out their social systems as well as kind of the recommendation engines. And I guess it's probably also helpful. Like I graduated from Carnegie Mellon with a degree in IS. So I'm from Dietrich. And I also did additional in statistics. So like data science, stats, entrepreneurship, and product management. So if anyone wants to ask about any of those things, feel free. Cool. So I thought it would be good to dig a little bit into just kind of my story. I don't really want to get into it too much. I only have 2 slides on it because I don't think it's the interesting part of the presentation. But for me, the interesting part for most founders, or when I talk to founders, is just how did they get started, right? Like where did the inspiration come from? Where did the story start? And for me, it was pretty kind of a CMU cliche. I was in 112. I took it freshman fall, and I didn't know what to do for my term project. And so I go to Cosby, who was the professor at the time, and I'm like, yo, like, what do you think I should do? I have this idea where like people drop off their business cards at conferences. And so I'll like analyze those business cards and help like get information about leads. And Cosby was like, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard in my life. Like, please don't build that. What if you use people's emails in order to help them find jobs and help them network? Which I don't really think was all that feasible or interesting, but I thought, hey, if I do what he told me, maybe I'll get an A, if it's his idea. So I think this is kind of hilarious. Like this is my 112 project. This is like from over 5 years ago, and it's just laughably terrible. I built the whole thing in tkinter. So like it's just so bad. I think there's like something especially funny. This is like my user sign up flow. I just got a bunch of JPEGs from Google Images. But the essential premise of the idea is that there's actually a lot of networking tools that students can use. Like LinkedIn is a really powerful tool for finding jobs. But we noticed that actually like a lot of people didn't have a LinkedIn, especially if you're like a freshman or a sophomore, you didn't feel comfortable getting a LinkedIn. And, you know, it was just really hard to figure out like how to network. Like the jobs process is very stressful and very difficult. And using LinkedIn was very hard. So we essentially, like the idea that we kind of had, or I had, was like, what if we built something that just used your email? So no LinkedIn, no sign up, and from your email, it would build a model of your network. And then like you would put in what kind of job you're looking for, like software engineer or product manager. And then it would just, you know, spend hours every day, like looking for as many jobs as possible that match that criteria. And it would only show you the jobs where you could find a referral, or where you knew someone, or where you or your friends knew someone. So essentially the whole premise is that, you know, it doesn't require any learning. You just put in like where you want to work, or what kind of job you want, and then it'll automatically find you a place where you can apply, and also like a referral that you have to get into that place. And so I just made the project. You know, it wasn't, you know, forming a company. It was just for 112. I didn't think about it too hard. But then I started showing it to my friends, and they were like, yo, does this work? Like, this is, you know, we would love help with this. Like, you know, if we could find us referrals, like that would be dope. And one of the kids that I was talking to, a friend of mine named Asher Silverglade, I don't know if any of you have ever met him. He's quite a character. He was like, if you build this, I'll get you 100 users. And I was like, dope, you're going to be my co-founder. So that's kind of how we met. And we were like, hey, like, let's start this. Damn it. Let's see. Cool. So yeah, I think that's the most interesting part of the story, I think, in terms of my entrepreneurial journey. I think even though it's kind of early, maybe I'll just still pause if anything's unclear, or anyone has any kind of questions they want to ask, or any idea, or getting started, or anything like that. Give it like a quick minute. Okay, cool. Everyone's on board. I'll just keep moving then. So now we had an idea, and we were kind of thinking, how do we turn this into something that is like legitimate? How do we turn it into a company? And we did something really dumb. You know, we kind of did something super naive, and I didn't know this at the time, but I'm going to now call the approach that we had the waterfall approach. So we were like, hey, like people already seem to like the idea that we have. Let's build out a really, really like beautiful, complex design that, you know, looks amazing, and let's have engineering build it, and then, you know, users will just come on, and, you know, it'll be great. So we came up with this. I designed this myself. You know, I'm pretty proud of it. It, you know, looked pretty cool, and you know, it was a lot of engineering effort. And and 6 months later, we were still building it, and, you know, a couple engineers got frustrated and left, and we didn't even get to finish it. And so we basically realized that the approach of like building something really complicated and really big without ever talking to your customer, or ever really like, you know, testing whether it's a good idea is really a recipe for disaster. It's a huge burden on engineering, and, you know, it really is a recipe for failure, because it's very rare that you actually know what your customer will want and what your customer will click with. And so it's very poor strategy. And so we were like, all right, that's cool. You know, let's do what's now like the most common way of trying to build and scale your company, which is something that's called lean entrepreneurship. There's like super famous bestseller book on this. What they say is, you know, don't go for this fancy design. You know, what you should do is you should build something. You should start really small. You know, what's the most important part of, you know, your company? So for us, it was like, you know, putting in the email and building a network. So let's just build that. Let's build a small thing first, and then let's make sure we're talking to customers. You know, show that to customers, build low fidelity wireframes like what you guys are doing, see what they think, and then, you know, build the next part of it. And that was much more helpful. You know, it was a great start. You know, engineering didn't give up. They didn't like throw their hands in the air, because we were building things really small, and they could kind of see that customers were liking it. So, you know, they didn't have to put in all the effort up front. And yeah, things were going good, but we still had a lot of issues. So, you know, after we built out this thing that users thought was very intuitive, and that made sense, we had a problem that I think almost every company has, which is retention. And so what we saw is, you know, the way the platform worked is you logged on, you entered your email, it built a network of your email, and you could add friends and you could see jobs, but no one would come back. And the reason no one came back is because every time you logged into the website, you just saw the same thing over and over again, right? It was just this table. And it wasn't exciting. It wasn't interesting. Why come back if you're just going to see the same thing over and over again? And so our retention was really poor. And again, retention is just the number of people who come back to the platform, after initially being signed up. So what we decided to do is we decided to build this like job recommendation thing. So you would put in like what job you're looking for, and then only if there were new jobs in the thing that like in the job function you were looking for, only then would it show you something. And every time it would change. So every time you log back into the platform, like you wouldn't see the same thing. So there'd be a reason to log in again. And that was something that was really important. I think a lot of people, when they build their company, they just kind of think about how do I provide my customer value, right? Like, why would my customer come to my product, my website, whatever? But the tough part is not getting someone to come to your website. The tough part is, why would they come back again, right? After they come back the first time, like how are we going to incentivize them, keep them excited about using your product? Because if you can't do that, then, it's going to die. And if it's just something where they get value once, it's hard to get them to any like meaningful stage of monetization. So that was the first problem we faced. And maybe it's kind of interesting to go through, how we thought through it. And maybe there were other ideas that you guys came up with on how we could have addressed that problem. The second problem we had is network effect. So, we had like a few hundred users, but not all the users' friends were on the platform, right? And so when building any sort of like social network, you need to make sure that each person who joins has enough people, right, that there's actually a network. And, if you put in your email and then there isn't any jobs, then, then you're just going to leave, right? So how can we push people to keep expanding their network? That was a big problem we kind of focused on for a while. And so one of the ideas we came up with to combat that was groups. So the way groups would work is we'd say, hey, look, like a lot of people are in clubs, are in organizations, and it's kind of awkward to ask friends to sign up for something. People aren't very likely to, spam their friends with these like invite links, because those are, those don't feel very natural. But for a lot of club organizations, it's really hard to manage their alumni groups. When people leave the group, right, or people graduate, like it's really hard to keep track of where they were, what their, network was, like if they can refer you somewhere. And so we basically kind of pivoted a little, and we're like, hey, like we're going to be an alumni system, get all of your student groups to join. And now that your whole group has joined, your whole student organization, like everyone has a network. And so we built in like the way to have groups. And once you join a group, everyone in that group is your friend in your network. So, that was kind of how we tried to approach the network effects problem. And yeah, we face many other challenges, but I think those are the two most interesting ones that a lot of you will probably face as you build products. How do you really leverage a network effect, and how do you kind of get people to come back? And some of the numbers we saw that were good was we had good user growth. We were able to get over 300 users because we were just onboarding like 50 users at a time through groups. And we also saw about a 20% retention rate for D7, which means that around 7 days after somebody came back, like 7 days after they signed up, they would come back to the platform again. And so that's pretty much an industry average. So it wasn't amazing, but it wasn't terrible. Like we didn't feel like we, the product had no value or no, sort of a value proposition to users. So this was great. Basically it seems like we'd solve stuff, but the more I started talking to students, the more, we got users, and I had more and more conversations. Like the more we realized that this wasn't going to grow. It wasn't growing slowly, but it wasn't growing really fast. It was just kind of stagnant. And there were a lot of barriers that were kind of keeping us from growing. Like the first was we were trying to teach people how to network. We had these little like tip buttons, and we wrote blog posts on how to reach out to your friends, and like, how to shake hands. And people just didn't want to do that. Like that ask of learning this and learning that and thinking about like these things was just too much. And the other thing we saw that we were really surprised by is that cold outreach was really successful. So if you had the right message and you could find the recruiter's email, then that was usually good enough to actually get a job and get an internship. And so what we decided is, if that's the case, why don't we build a cold outreach system to find jobs as opposed to a warm outreach one? So, the thing that people really valued and found hard was getting a recruiter's email, right? Like if they want to work at Apple or Google or any of these places, like that's great. But if I want to reach out to a recruiter and be like, hey, like I really want to work here, like please look at my resume. How do you reach out to that recruiter? How do you find their email? And when you have their email, what do you say to them, right? Like, how is this email out of the blue going to help you? And this is actually a solved problem. So like a lot of companies, find leads through these like really spammy like lead generation email tools. So there's a lot of APIs, a lot of like technology already built to find email addresses. And also it's much easier to give somebody an email template and be like, hey, like this is how you should reach out to recruiters, as opposed to teaching them like the soft skills of networking and what to ask people and things like that. And so this new idea that we had, which we called Job Buddy, is just kind of a, not a great name, but what we basically were able to come up with was a lot simpler. You know, the tech was much easier, and it was much easier to scale because you didn't have to put in your email metadata, which had a lot of privacy concerns. You didn't have to, you know, have 10,000 people as your friends or in your network. Like it would kind of automatically bring you a lot of value right out the gate. And so that was a really long-winded explanation. But when I started Idea to Startup, and as me and Vivek kind of helped a lot of teams scale, we saw that like the same thing that happened to me in NetScale happened to a lot of people. So like what would happen is, you know, you would do a bunch of user interviews and you would, you know, talk to customers and you would see that they have a real problem, but it would still take forever, like a year, right, to really understand if your solution was solving your problem for your customer, right? Like you build the idea, but nobody comes back. So you have to build a way of getting retention. And once you build retention, you have to figure out, okay, how many of these people are, you know, actually getting jobs? And so it still takes a long time to find product market fit. And finding product market fit or making sure that your solution is actually solving a problem is really critical. You know, once you have that, everything else will work out, right? Because you're really building on the right thing. And it comes way too late in the lean entrepreneurship method. It really takes a while. So what we really wanted to do was, how can we help you understand if you're building the right thing before you ever build anything? Before you spend years with engineers, like going through all these steps and going through all these loopholes, like how can we kind of fake having a product so that you immediately find product market fit and then you worry about building a real product? And the way you do that is actually not super glamorous or kind of the method that we came up with. The way you do it is by kind of doing a lot of bitch work in the front or doing a lot of grunt work. So essentially what you do is you kind of become the product. So like the way it would work is, you know, if I was to build NetScale again, instead of, you know, starting to build in like low fidelity mocks and, you know, just, you know, working on small pieces of engineering, I would just say, okay, I want to help students get a job, right? So I would just find as many students as I can, and I would help them get a job. I would sit with them. I would apply with them. I would help them get an interview. And I would just completely forget about the product or the building or the platform. And once I had this cycle of solving the problem, right, then I would say, okay, what am I doing that's working, that's actually solving this problem for a user? And how can I automate that? So the difference is really nuanced, and I haven't really found a super easy way to explain it. But essentially what you're doing is the first time you solve a user's problem happens way later, and you want to solve a user's problem like way earlier, so you actually know that you're solving the user's problem. And the way to do that, again, is kind of just loading yourself out for free and building insight and expertise on solving that problem. So again, like with Job Buddy, if I were to build that, instead of starting with, you know, building a product or sketching a website, I'd sit with students and ask them to apply for jobs. And then the next company I built after I built NetScale was a thing called Sales Buddy. And Sales Buddy was a lead generation tool. So I kind of realized there's more money in enterprise sales. And I kind of just like found an algorithm that helps generate customers, like customer emails for people who want to sell. But I didn't do that by having an idea and then building it right away. I literally reached out to 5 or 6 companies and I said, hey, do you have trouble like finding leads? Let me find leads for you for free. And so I spent several weeks like working for free for these companies, helping them find leads. And then I started building the product, because then I had a lot more insight on how to actually solve the problem of the customer. And so I know I'm banging this point on the head, but I'll kind of try to explain it one more way. So usually what happens with the lean entrepreneurship method is, you know, you have some problem, but you don't know if you have a solution, and you start with the wrong idea, right? Your first idea is almost always the wrong idea. It's not really what's solving a person's problem. And then you kind of have these local optimization points, right? Where things don't work, but you know, you locally optimize, you solve problems and you locally optimize, right? And then usually after you have these like after you have these first few ideas, you get another idea, and that's the right idea. So with this new process that we call the AHAT hypothesis, it's kind of like you start building a product a lot later. You have like zero effectiveness in terms of a product, but you get to that third or fourth idea a lot quicker. And then once you have that third or fourth idea that's actually good, you can scale a lot faster. Like the right product, it starts growing by itself. And the wrong product is the kind of one where you just feel like you're pushing it and it's just this huge boulder on your back and it's not failing, but it's really hard to kind of get going, get that growth, get things to click. And so it's kind of a way of short circuiting the first few bad ideas right away. I think. Cool. So yeah, I think it'd be really cool to try to get to the codeless demo, but this might be a good stopping point to kind of see how people are feeling, maybe if that makes sense. I also have some sample questions here. If people can't come up with any, like how to build a team or advice for your specific projects, like doesn't need to be super relevant to the stuff that I presented on. So does anyone have any questions? I'll keep this slide going just for a good background, or maybe I'll just stop sharing for now.
I think a few of our groups are working on like social network based stuff. So maybe they have some questions for you.
Who's working on social networking stuff? Maybe it'd be cool if maybe I can hear from you guys then what kind of ideas you're working on.
I was wondering like how you would build like a user base off of like a networking site, because like when you first start, you don't have a lot of users. So it's like pretty hard to scale in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to just kind of give you really specific advice. What kind of network are you trying to build? I think it was Andrew, right?
Yeah, okay. It's kind of meta, but like it's like a networking for startups specifically, because like it's pretty hard to find like, from like person to person, especially when there's no real like thing for that yet. And so I was wondering like what we should do.
Yeah, so I think for building networks or effective strategies like affiliate marketing. So essentially what you do is you try to find a network that already exists, right? Like maybe an accelerator or maybe like some sort of like LinkedIn group, or where's a place where there's already a few startups that know each other, and then try to convince the owner of that organization or of that group to be like, hey, do you mind if we did a pilot? Like here are the 3 things I think are going to be really helpful. Like we're going to decrease your costs, we're going to increase the amount of XYZ, and do you mind setting a meeting with all the startups in your accelerator or all the startups that are using your product, and like let them try the product. It'll be completely free, and like I'll be here the whole time to make sure that it's helpful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So like when you like talk to them, do you just like hit them up like out of nowhere, or like how do you like talk to them?
Yeah, I think usually cold outreach is actually pretty effective, is what I've found.
Oh,
So
okay.
if you just find it, like another thing that we did specifically for Sales Buddy. So when I mentioned for Sales Buddy, like we just reached out to Schwartz. So I knew Dave Mowini pretty well, but we also kind of, I guess through the UA, like this is something you can also ask Vivek about. Like since you're doing startups, like maybe you can just talk to the Schwartz accelerators. Like I've talked to them before, and that's how we kind of launched Sales Buddy. They're usually pretty open to just chatting with other people that are, or senior students that are working on startups. So I think there's one that's really nearby, and then there was another Pittsburgh accelerator, but I forget what their name was. Like I think there's a few, but it'd probably be good if maybe like Dave or someone from Schwartz introduced you. Also, Kit from Project Olympus probably also knows a lot of startups, and so trying to leverage the CV network might be the most effective strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Anyone else have any questions or anything they want to get off their chest? Interesting things they're working on?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about what my team and I are working on. So ours is an app where you can basically like rent clothes from your neighbors. So it's kind of related to the social networking idea, but what do you think? What do you think are some obstacles we might face in that idea?
So it's basically about renting clothes, you said?
Yeah, so basically you'd be able to go on the app, you'd see what kinds of clothes people around you are willing to rent, and then you'd be able to exchange it for like a weekend, for example, and
Yeah,
then give it back.
I think like that's an idea. I think that's really interesting. I think a thing that might be difficult for that is like monetization. I think I've seen kind of often that there's these apps where people immediately download into the app and then they find these groups. And then, if you take some sort of commission, they try to like work around you. Like they'll give each other, they'll give each other like their email addresses or connect on Facebook or create some sort of other group. And so I think that that's something that's kind of difficult. But if you built like a unique network, like maybe there's other ways to monetize, like getting people to go through your payment system to switch or rent or anything like that when there's already like Venmo and a lot of other tools that make it easy to play. It's pretty hard. But if you do some sort of like engagement based thing, ads are not great. I don't really like ads as a business model, but if there's like an auxiliary way to monetize that, I think that would be very helpful. And yeah, I mean, the biggest problem with that's obviously just going to be finding like the right size, right? Like you need enough people where people are the same size, people have enough like good taste. And so that's like it's not a simple, but it's like a very core network effect problem, right? It's going to be tough to hit that like critical mass right away. But Vivek, you guys going to do like pilots and stuff too later on?
Yeah, so right now we're surveying people who might be interested in the app, and then we've been working on wireframes.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. I think I'd try to maybe like run a pilot, like maybe like an RA and Stever or like Morewood or something, and be like, hey, like let's try this with everyone that's on our floor. But also, like I think another thing that might be a problem with that is retention. Like, how often do people really need to like rent clothes? Is that something that happens often?
Yeah.
But probably actually is. Maybe it's not as big of an issue, but what's the reason to kind of keep coming back? Like, and what's the frequency of it? I think that'd be something that's important to determine.
Yeah, and then other things also like sharing clothes during a pandemic. So that's something we have to think about. But yeah.
Yeah, and what's really the value? Is it just that they're cheaper? Like maybe there's some sort of like sharing clothes where you share clothes with someone who like has a better understanding of fashion, or I really wonder like what the unique value proposition is there, and what's really the value that you're competing on. Like, is it just cost? Like, I know there's also like Rent the Runway, right, which also does renting clothes for some other type
Yeah,
of
it is very similar. And another aspect is sustainability and the environmentally conscious population that we might be trying to target.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like room for this space. I think Rent the Runway like has cleared many of like the hurdles and just the thought of renting clothes. So but yeah, it's gonna be challenging.
Sweet, thank you so much.
No problem. All right, maybe one more question, and then I'll try to get to the codeless prototype for those that are interested. Cool. All right. Seems like we got all the questions out of the way. So let me talk about this. This is something I'm a little new to myself, but I really think it's really helpful for people that are in an accelerator. So let me kind of get to that. Cool. So full disclaimer, I actually copied some of this from a presentation I heard a few weeks ago by New Grad AI. So not unlike the rest of the content, which is completely original. This is not as original. But essentially, like a big problem again is building stuff is really hard, and building stuff takes a long time. And the easier it is to build something, the faster you can build something, the more iterations you can do of the product, and that really helps get you more success. So this is something that I built using like a codeless programming tech stack, and essentially, let me stop sharing my screen because I don't think you can see this anymore. But essentially, this is like a really simple website. All it does is there's an API that basically gets like listings of housings, like housings that are available. And then, oh no, I hope it didn't. I hope it didn't break as I was about to demo it. So these are all like real listings that I got from an API. And then really simply, you can like filter it, and you can like search for specific things, because the Bronx was a bad filter term. And it's something that I just kind of built in a day. And so usually like the tech stack for this wouldn't be too complicated, but it would still be pretty annoying. Like you would need some sort of database and some sort of authentication system. And then, the front end for this would also be pretty annoying. So the way that this works is it uses something called Airtable. And so Airtable is basically just a fancy spreadsheet. Like it looks like Google Sheets, and it's not like a database. You don't require a ton of like code or authentication or any of the other stuff. And the way that this works is that I basically just have a Python script that, calls information from the API. And the cool thing about Airtable is that it's really easy to edit using Python. So all you really have to do is after you get the data, like you can just use the API to add these records to the table, and it will automatically update on the table, and the table will automatically update this builder. And so let me see if I can like log in here and show you how like like how unimpressive this whole thing is, even though it already probably doesn't look super impressive because it's a very simple application. Did I use this? I can't remember what I used for this thing. Nope, that was the wrong one. Sorry, give me 1 sec. Oh no, let me quickly put in my password here. Damn. I'm having some issues with logging in there. Just move on to the images that I had just in case of this. All right, cool. So yeah, so basically the backend and the backend of this is just Python and then using Airtable, and the front end is basically completely provided through Pori.io and Notion. So they have all these templates, and they literally have a button that says connect with Airtable, and you don't really have to do any of that server side setup. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the whole way that it works. And then I guess just some last minute advice as a last slide that I throw together. But to reemphasize, it's not hard to get customers to come to your site. It's hard for them to come back. And so that's something that usually takes a lot of thought to build out. The other thing I think is surprising advice that you have to give, but like, don't be afraid to fail, but also don't be afraid to succeed, in the sense that like there was this, this guy at CMU who was building this company, and he, was really into the environment. And so he wanted to build plastic bags that were environmentally friendly. And he did some user testing, and he saw that that might not be something that's feasible at a price point that will scale. So he came to me and he's like, hey, how about I build this like company that helps educate people on building code, and it's like a code education company. And I was like, sure, like let's say this works, right? And you spend the next 5 years building this website that helps kids learn how to code or whatever. Like, would that be something that you want? Like, do you want to spend 5 years of your life building this thing and just kind of being consumed by education and kids? And he was like, no, like that would be awful. And I'm like, then why build it, right? Like, it's not just about, hey, if I fail, it's no big deal. There's no risk. It's also, yeah, but what if you succeed, right? You want that successful scenario to be one that actually, is one that you want. And I think that's what people give the really cliche advice, like do something you're passionate about, because it's not about having a good idea, right? It's not about having a business model that works. Like, once you start a company, like that company is going to take over your life. And so, you really need to make sure you're starting something that, you will be fine, like working with, or, if it takes off and you get VC funding, you have to leave college early, like, are you going to be willing to like leave your friends and leave college and not graduate? Like, is that going to be something that you're fine with? Like, sometimes I feel like people are, just get so caught up in the fact that failure isn't a big deal. It's something that's good on the resume, that they don't really think about what would happen if they're successful. And, if you're not playing to win, then there really isn't a point in playing, right? Because, either way, you fail, you win, you kind of lose either way. And the last thing I'll say is it's actually really hard to figure out if what you're building is working or not. You think it's really easy to tell, because, hey, like if it doesn't work, there's just going to be this huge failure at launch. Like people are going to tell me the idea is dumb, but that doesn't really happen. Like a lot of the times people continue working on bad ideas, and because they're really smart, they're kind of making it work. And, they're just pushing this heavy boulder, really, really slowly. And, the product isn't really working, but they can't tell that because the growth is really stagnant. And so I would be really weary of that. Like, when a product is working, it takes a long time, and usually it takes at least 1 to 2 years. Like it's hard to really tell before then, but like the right product kind of should be clicking and it should be growing on its own. And so if something isn't working, like it's not always going to be obvious. And the last piece of advice I have is, people always think that the most important skill you need to be an entrepreneur is that you need to be like a tech genius, or you need to be like a really slick salesman. But I actually think the most important skill is HR, it's human resources. Like you need to be good at figuring out who you need to build what you want, and how are you going to find that person. Another super cliche thing, which is quoting Steve Jobs, but I think Steve Jobs said something like, the job of like a CEO or founder is to find the best person to build the product or to sell the product. It's not to do it yourself. It's to be able to find that person who is a good fit for it. And I think HR never really gets any respect. No one ever considers HR. No one thinks it's that important, but it is a super important skill. And I would say like one of the most important. You don't need to know how to do anything. You just need to know how to find out who can do something and be able to get them to join your team. So that was everything I had. I think that's, now we can actually just chat for the rest of the time. But yeah, I just wanted to show a little more about how to iterate quickly using codeless programming, and just kind of give a lot of disparate, maybe not super comprehensive advice that I kind of saw a lot when me and Vivek were running the program a few years ago. Does any of that make sense? Anything kind of unclear? Questions on advice or like how the tech stack for the codeless programming worked? I didn't get to demo it fully, so totally fair if there's something that was unclear.
I mean, I guess you can implement that whole thing in like a few days, right?
Yeah.
Codeless. So
I learned about it last week, and then I just did it Saturday. I was like, hey, this would be something cool to talk about, but I have to learn how to do it first. So yeah. I just kind of like went through it. And it's pretty flexible. I think that's the big thing. Like you could use Weebly. Like there's a lot of like templates, but obviously like those are just good for landing pages. I think you could mimic a lot of products through a really flexible system like that. So I think that's like the big thing about it, that it is codeless, but it's not one of those, just kind of drag and drop templated things. I think if you have a flexible database, like that already gives you a lot of opportunity to kind of build something fast.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I think it's a few of our teams, like we have ideas, but we haven't like completely implemented them. So I think your advice is pretty good for that stuff.
Yeah. Also, me and Asher are both Tepper students, so like we didn't know how to code for shit. But for us, it's definitely like it's not just that building things is hard, but also like learning to code is not hard. And the thing with engineers, like engineers are kind of really difficult because nobody wants to be the first engineer to join your team, right? Like I've always found it's much easier to get like an engineer to get other engineers, but getting that first engineer is always really tough. And so if you can show that you've built anything, even something that's dumb, like it kind of helps the engineer feel like, hey, like I'm not going to be carrying this whole load, and I'm not working with someone who doesn't really understand, anything about technology. So I think like it's helpful if you have engineers to quickly prototype, but if you don't, it's helpful in getting engineers, which is, like I said, I think one of the toughest things is getting the right people to join the company.
All right. Anyone have any specific questions in terms of their ideas? Let's see. I don't want to call it anyone. It's weird, but I guess our ideas are pretty early stage, so it's kind of hard to make a leap of faith, I guess. So any advice on that? Like when do you actually make the jump from theoretical ideas to actually doing something?
I think I can interpret that first by just how do you know like your idea is kind of a good one? And I really think, again, like I would just not worry about your idea at all, right? Like, for example, the person who was talking about renting clothes, like, I wouldn't worry about building a platform to rent clothes. Like, what's the reason you came up with the idea, right? What's that pain point you're trying to solve? And just try to solve that pain point as mercilessly as possible for as many people as possible. And you can almost never come up with the right idea. I've never seen it be the case that someone is like, I need to do this, and then they build it and it works. It's always like they build it and then it's a failure, and then like 6 ideas later, because while building the idea, they've talked to so many people, they find the right thing. So it's never like, it's not that important to find the right idea. I think it's more of like, whose pain point are you really solving something for? And then just sit next to them and tell them you'll work 60 hours a week for free to help them solve that. And then the idea will just come by itself. You go like, hey, I'm an expert at this. How can I just automate what I do? Since we're not getting too many questions, I think I had this last time, but I forgot it. Like, I think the best example of this is Headspace. The story of Headspace is really interesting. Basically it was this guy who was tired of his life, so he became a monk and went to Nepal. And he spent 10 years as a monk, and he gave away all his worldly possessions and all that, but he also did consulting to survive. So he would like do meditation consulting. And one day this like marketing consultant took him on as like a meditation guru, and he was like, hey, like we should like monetize this. And so like those, like, again, Headspace is such a, like, the technology is so basic, right? It's basically just a podcast, just a series of audio recordings. Why would anyone pay for that, right? It's because that man spent 10 years building useful insight, right? He got really good at solving this problem. And then the idea, it didn't matter. The idea was almost like meaningless. It was the insight that, was what people were paying for. And so really get good at building that insight. And we're all super new, right? Even me, I have like 1 year of work experience. Like, it's, for us, it's more important. Like if you've been a consultant for 10 years, like you kind of already did that. That's why a lot of people come up with these ideas and kind of worked in the industry, and they have already felt this problem so deeply. But for us, that's hard because, we're just kind of so young and new to stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Anyone else have any final questions? Yeah, Roshi.
Okay, so this is more of a personal question, but having like started your own startups and now working as a product manager, where do you see yourself in the future with potential new startups?
That's a good question. I think I'm going to give an answer that maybe is a little disappointing. Like, at least for the short term future, like I don't see myself starting another company. I think people always kind of see entrepreneurs as this this really cool, great job that maybe is better than other jobs. But personally, I've found that like working in a large company and kind of analyzing their data and being able to leave work at 5 and not really having to think about the idea anymore has been something that I've enjoyed a lot. So I really like the 9 to 5. I think entrepreneurship was something that was really great, but I didn't realize how much of me it was consuming, and I'm looking forward to spending more time in my current role. And I haven't thought much about kind of going full time and starting something right away, because I kind of appreciate the being able to have a weekend and not constantly kind of being obsessed by one user problem or another. So I don't really have much of a goal, but I'm having fun working at Roblox and hoping to be able to stay there for a few more years.
Okay, I will stop recording.